There is a quote, "Activism is your rent for being on the planet." I really feel very strongly that it's our responsibility to really reach out and support each other as a community. My name is Andrea Taylor. I presently am the sole entrepreneur for Women's Encore and for TaylorConsulting. I was born in New York City, and we moved to Louisville, Kentucky, actually when I was around 10. It was a segregated city. My very best friend was African American, and her family would not let her come to visit me, and I couldn't quite figure out why. It really kind of spurred me on to get very involved in civil rights activities. It was the time in which Louisville was desegregating. So at the age of 13 or 14, I was involved in sit-ins, marches. I was arrested 4 times before I was 15. Then I went to college during the Vietnam War and became very involved in anti-war demonstrations there. So I've kind of had a long history of activism. So really I feel as though all the work that I've done has been very much influenced by those concerns and those issues. I went to a Quaker school, and there was a plaque on the outside of the building that said, "Let your lives speak," and it's a quote from George Fox. It has really been kind of a guiding principle for me, and I feel as though the work that I've done, first as a teacher in the School District of Philadelphia and then subsequently through Temple University and across ages, really is my life speaking and my legacy. Across Ages is a multi-intervention approach to drug prevention for middle school students. I am the developer of Across Ages and was the director for 12 to 15 years. We had this idea of developing a program that incorporated mentoring because of the research that we did around looking at significant adult relationships for young people as a resilience factor. We recruit mentors who are 50 and over. Most of our mentors are in their 60s and 70s. We have some in their 80s. The students also got involved in community service activities, visiting with residents in nursing homes. They participated in a life skills training program, and we had monthly activities for family members and siblings. This really gave me a chance to bring together my interest in older adults and my experience in working as a school teacher, and really bringing these 2 generations together for mutual benefit. When I went to graduate school, I actually went to graduate school for education, and I went specifically through a program called National Teacher Corps, which trained teachers for inner city communities, for Indian reservations, to teach in Appalachia, basically school systems where kids were not getting the kind of education they needed. And so I stopped demonstrating because I felt that I was actually also living out those principles of, equality and justice by teaching in the Philadelphia public school system, which was the most challenging work I have ever done to date. I taught for 2 years in a school in North Philadelphia. There was a lot of gang activity in the community and in the schoolyard at night or on the weekends. And I remember the first time I ever took over a class by myself, I was so anxious that I could feel the floor moving. I mean, it was tough. And but it was probably a remarkable education for me, not only in terms of what I learned about teaching, but what I learned about working with children and working with their families and what issues around extreme poverty and violence could really do to young people. I left the School District of Philadelphia after 15 years and took a job as the Director of Training at Philadelphia Corporation for Aging, which is the area agency on aging for Philadelphia County, which means that's where all the funds for aging services go through. As the Director of Training, I worked with senior centers and all the providers of services to older people in the area. Nancy Hankin is the founder and recently retired executive director of the Intergenerational Center at Temple University. The Intergenerational Center is like a little nonprofit that sits inside the university. And the focus of our work was bringing older adults and young people together for the purpose of addressing community needs. Nancy has been a very dear friend. I actually first met her when she came to my office when I was the training director at Philadelphia Corporation for Aging, and she was looking for money, which I actually had to give away, probably the only time in my life that's been true. And so I was able to actually help get a project funded that brought kids, young people together with people who were attending senior centers. Several years later, there was a position open at the Intergenerational Center, and I interviewed for that and started to work there. We did a lot of really important work and gave, I think, people who are marginalized in society, that being older adults and young people, an opportunity to really come together and serve one another and serve their communities. After I had been working at the Intergenerational Center for about 3 years, I was contacted by a former colleague of mine from the School District of Philadelphia who wanted to start a program, a pilot program for really high-risk middle school students. And he was interested in having a mentoring component, and he wanted it specifically to be intergenerational. So he came to talk with me about helping to get that set up. At the same time, a man named Mark Friedman, who has become really pivotal in the conversation about older adults in this country, had written a early work called The Kindness of Strangers, which was a study that he had done about several intergenerational mentoring programs across the country. And I had just started to read that. I believe my colleague had started to read it also. And so we were really intent on seeing if we could replicate some of that work with this particular program that my colleague wanted to start. At about that same time, SAMHSA put out an RFP for a drug prevention project for middle school students. And we decided that this would be a really terrific way to potentially fund some of this further research, because this was both a research and demonstration project. So it was a confluence of important events that resulted in the creation of the Across Ages program. There were a number of things that influenced resilience in very high-risk kids. The first was the presence of significant adult support. The second was engagement in meaningful work activities. The third was basic life skills training to help kids resist peer pressure. And the fourth was engaging families. Those four things really led to the creation of what became the Across Ages program. We set up our program so that we could try to tease out the effects of mentoring. We asked our mentors to spend 2 to 3 hours per week with their mentees. One of the things we know about mentoring is that consistency is really key. So it's better to spend an hour a week than it is to spend a full day and then not to see the child for 3 to 4 weeks. So it was really the consistency that we were looking for. The activities that they did together, very often it was around homework. They would go to the movies sometimes. They would go to the mall. They would go to baseball games, sporting events, that kind of thing. One of the first mentors to be interviewed was a man by the name of Neil Cunningham. And as he will tell the story, he really came in looking for a job. He didn't realize he was signing up to be a volunteer mentor. He had had a very troubled youth and childhood. His mother had died when he was 12. And he spent his early years always in a lot of trouble and had had some significant substance abuse issues himself. He was in a 12-step program, worked it faithfully, and was really trying to make something of himself in this kind of second part of his life. He turned out to be one of the most amazing mentors, and he and I are friends to this day. He usually mentored a team of boys. He was the one that took the kids around the city of Philadelphia, showed them how to use the subway, took them out for meals and showed them how to order from a menu and how to offer the right tip. He would go into the classrooms with the kids and sit down at the desk and say, now you have to pay attention because I need to pass the 6th grade. He was actually working on his GED himself. And he was so proud of the boys that he mentored. He would carry their report cards around with him in his pocket and show people how well these kids were doing in school. I think in addition to just the things he did, what was so remarkable about him was that he really listened. And he came from a place of empathy. And rather than saying, you shouldn't do this or you ought to do this, he was able to model that for the kids. Successful mentoring really hinges on that mutuality of experience, which essentially refers to the fact that if a mentor comes into a relationship with the idea that they're going to rescue that young person and that they know best and it's going to be their way, those relationships very rarely are sustained. What really needs to happen is for a mentor to come in knowing that they are going to learn from the child and that each of them has something to contribute to that relationship. The evaluation of Across Ages was set up to look first at all of the interventions combined in terms of the outcomes for the students. So we had two groups of kids, one group of students who had all of the interventions that I just described, and a second group of students who did not have mentors, but did engage in the community service activities, the life skills, and the family activities. What we found out was that all the kids who were in Across Ages had statistically significant positive results. We found, however, that the students who had mentors did better. We were seeing significant results, specifically in the area of increased school attendance, decreased school suspensions, decreased substance use, increased self-esteem. The more involved that the mentors were with the students, the better they did. Just prior to the study that we published, a landmark study of Big Brothers Big Sisters had been published, which really suggested that mentoring was an effective intervention. And then we were able to publish additional research that really demonstrated that fact also. If I had an opportunity to do Across Ages again, I think I would not make it such a complicated model. I would really focus very specifically on the mentoring component and build in some of the other activities within that. Trying to run a program that had 4 different components to it, in 3 different schools with 3 different groups in each school was logistically a nightmare. Most of the replications around the country have not been done in school-based settings. They've been done as after-school models, and they've kind of followed that protocol a little bit more. And I think it's been a bit easier to, implement a really comprehensive program without so many moving parts. One of the challenges I see in programs that are designed to ameliorate conditions for high-risk kids is that the children who participate can often be labeled. We tried to avoid that stigma with Across Ages by making this the program that the kids wanted to be involved in. So our approach was, you better hurry up and get your application in because you don't want to miss out. One day I was walking up the steps of a school and I felt this tug at my coat, and there's a little boy behind me who really wanted to be in the program, and he said, Dr. Taylor, when am I going to get one of those? When am I going to get a mender? And I thought that's really a great way to describe a mentor as a mender. During the years that we were running the Across Ages program, the Center for Substance Abuse Prevention was also looking at the data for our project and a number of others because they really were interested in starting a replication process. And this is how NREPP came to be. By the 3rd year, we had some statistically significant data to share, and we were then invited to submit a proposal for an RFP that CSAP was putting out in order to be able to replicate ourselves. It was also put out to other entities around the country to see what programs might want to replicate us. There were 7 programs initially that were identified to become part of this NREPP process. And I remember we spent endless hours working with Steve Gardner and other staff from the Center for Substance Abuse Prevention on what this replication process should look like. We published a training manual. We had a research article published in the Journal of Primary Prevention. We put together a fidelity instrument, and we had an evaluation protocol. There are several things that are important for potential replicators to consider if they want to implement Across Ages. One is that mentoring is not a panacea for every child, and that potential replicators really need to consider who the population of students are that are being mentored. The second thing that I have learned is that mentors do not beat a path to your door. They may not be readily available, so it's important to assess the potential pool of mentors and also to think very carefully about the types of recruitment messages that you use to get them. The third thing is that it's very important to use evidence-based practices in terms of developing your mentoring program. There are many mentoring programs that have sprung up across the country in recent years, and they're not always viable. The worst thing you can do for a child that has trust issues is to get them involved in a mentoring program and then have that mentor disappear and have the program not sustain itself. Over the years, there have been approximately 90 replications of the Across Ages program, and I've done the training for pretty much all of them. So it's really been a very enlightening and humbling experience for me. I've traveled all over the country, and I've really experienced a couple of things. One is that people who go into this line of work are incredibly dedicated, and they all are really there because they want to do good things for the youth in their community. One of the challenges in replicating a program like Across Ages is that it's very relationship driven. So when I look at the different types of evidence-based programs that are out there, I think about them in terms of those that are curriculum driven and those that are relationship driven. Curriculum-driven program would be something like Gil Botvin's Life Skills Training, where it's very specific. There's a manual, there's a set of lessons, and it's very clear how that needs to be implemented in a classroom setting. Across Ages, on the other hand, is really dependent on finding the right people to be mentors, nurturing those relationships between the mentors and the youth, engaging families in a way that's going to be meaningful and relevant and culturally competent. All of those things are really important considerations when you replicate a program like Across Ages. And so what I've learned is to really work carefully with the developers in the different communities as to how to adapt this program to work in their community. So when I look at fidelity for Across Ages, there are certain elements that absolutely must be done as I did it. So for example, it's really focused on older adults as mentors. So I've had calls from people saying, I really like your program, but I think I'm going to recruit mentors who are in their 20s and 30s. And I go, no, because there are specific reasons why older people make good mentors for these kids. There are other things, however, that can be adapted. So when I look at the community service component of the program, it may be that visiting with residents in a nursing home is not something that's going to work in that particular community. But there are other ways of getting kids involved in providing service. There are also cultural considerations in terms of replicating Across Ages, particularly around the mentoring component. There are some cultures in which having an adult that's not related to a child be involved in their lives in some way is really not acceptable. And so these are the kinds of things that you really have to discuss with potential replicators. One of the things that I've always wanted any funding agency to do is to require a letter from the developer of one of the model programs so that when they apply for funds, the funding agency knows that they've had a conversation. I have found that those people who called me in advance as they were writing their proposals, A, submitted much better and stronger proposals, and B, if they got funded, had a much easier time in implementing the program. I frequently got calls from sites that got funded without my knowledge, and they were having a really difficult time because they hadn't really been able to assess the climate in the community. They had no idea how to tap into, older people as mentors, and they really needed more support around how to make this work in their community. I've done a lot of research on the work of Erik Erikson and his concept of generativity, which essentially means I am what survives of me. And it's the need that we have as we get older to leave a legacy. And one of the ways that we do that is by nurturing the next generation. As parents, it could be our own children, but as we get older, what we hope is that generativity and that care and concern will reach out as part of the larger community. What I learned from working with Across Ages and working with these older mentors is that that's exactly what happened. And one of the reasons that they became so dedicated to the program and so loyal to the children was because it really gave them an opportunity to give back and to feel that their lives had meaning. I think what Across Ages has contributed to the research on prevention and the research on mentoring is the fact that significant adult relationships really do have an impact on young people, and that with that kind of guidance and support, it helps them not only to avoid substance use, but all of the other challenges that occur for many young people. I think that the idea of older adults as mentors is something that people really hadn't thought much about and is now at least a part of the conversation at some level. I think probably the most surprising and really exciting thing about Across Ages was to see the dedication of the mentors to really understand what they got out of this experience and to see these relationships that developed between these young people and these adults. There's really no way to write about that on paper, even in a final report that says how wonderful it was. You really have to experience it yourself. And when I see these pairs, there are mentors and young people who to this day, 20-something years later, are still together in one way or another. I mean, that is really quite remarkable, and I think it really speaks to a lot of the work that we did in the very beginning about nurturing the relationships, but just also how powerful that bond can be between people. And I think when given the opportunity to have a voice and to step up, people will do it. They just have to be asked.